So we have Wendy, Alison, and Sandra. Why don't we begin by asking each of you if you have responses to the other talks that we heard this morning. It's such an integrated theme, isn't it? Different aspects of the same theme.
I have to say, I wish we could take credit for coordinating, but we didn't. But but they actually ended up being very complimentary. I mean, it was great seeing, I think, everything from what's coming through the pike, how parents and caregivers and IRBs and clinicians are thinking about this as it's coming through. I think, you know, Sandra's summary is true at the end, as having sort of a neutral party in terms of being able to explain all of the very complicated things is a very important issue. And then I just personally listened to what Alison's saying and thinking about through the access issues in terms of both clinical trials and then when we actually get things approved. I mean, the scary thing to me is that this can't continue to cost as much as it does on a per person basis. I mean, at some point, hopefully we have the breakthroughs in technology that we scale. And so the incremental cost of this just has to come down, and we've got to figure out ways of doing that. Otherwise, we are going to be in a very inequitable situation, or we're going to break the bank in terms of healthcare. And
absolutely, yeah.
I guess the only comment I would add is that in that last presentation that Sandra did, that was so really true to life from what I've been hearing from these individuals as well, is there's really this question of, do we need to get people to understand what is research and what is not research, what is treatment, or do we need to come up with a third category, which is, there is a third category, it's called innovative treatment, and it has its own rules and way of being monitored. So that's a question I think a lot about. And I know that Ruth Faden and others have proposed that we need to get away from this, you know, research treatment dichotomy. And so maybe this is an area in which that is possible.
Yeah, I think, I was just going to say, Alison, you know, what you said at the end of your presentation about I think it was the round peg trying to get into the square, or maybe it was the square peg getting into the round. But I do think conceptually we might have outrun this idea of research versus clinical care, because clearly it's a spectrum, and these emerging, you know, approaches require different oversight, maybe even a different consent process. I mean, I would really love to hear from folks in the room, you know, what that might look like, because clearly this idea that, you know, if it is research, it needs to be generalizable. It needs to have some type of benefit beyond the individual patient in front of you. I mean, are we ready to make those kinds of claims? It seems as if, from what we heard from the IRB members, there is this push against that boundary, right? So thinking more expansively, perhaps beyond what is realistic in terms of these approaches, but trying to bring in kind of this idea of future benefit for future patients when things are really uncertain. Anyway.
So Sandra, let me add another dimension that I don't think I heard you get into with the interviews, which is very pragmatic, which is who pays. And so this question of clinical versus research, if it's clearly clinical, then who pays is insurance or families, but this is a clinical care cost, right? And then if it's research, this is research dollars, oftentimes NIH, but others. But with these N of one things, NIH isn't funding those. And the question then becomes who pays. And from an equity point of view, as Alison was pointing out, you know, these can cost up to $1 million, and just each one of these treatments in terms of clinical care cost, you know, each visit could be $50,000 in terms of doing what needs to be done. And I'll just say very practically, that's a lot of what's coming up now in the centers around at least the US that I know that are doing this, and then trying to make the distinction, is it research? Is it clinical? Is it hybrid? If it's hybrid, who pays what in terms of this? And I do think all of us think we're going to be, whatever you call it, tomato, tomato, potato, potato, we're in the early phases where we're learning. And I think there are generalizable learnings we're going to do, whatever we call it. But it is coming down to very pragmatically the financial aspect in terms of this. And like I said, because of that, people are being excluded.
And
go ahead.
I'll just say that we do have, we did ask our stakeholders these questions about equity and funding. And I'm I'm not prepared to tell you what our findings are, but what I will say, and I think it's fair, I would love to hear what Paul thinks because he was in those interviews, but there's a big knowledge gap, I think, in general on how people understand how things get paid. Because, you know, there is this kind of sense that things should be paid, but who does that and how it works is clear from at least some of our interview data that there's really a misunderstanding. But anyway, Alison, I interrupted you. You were going to say.
I was going to hit the similar theme and say that's why I tend to use the phrase N of too small to be commercially viable, because I want people to understand that the reason that research costs are being paid for by industry is because it's sort of the startup cost to what they will then monetize. And if there's nothing to be monetized here, there's no incentive for industry to pay these costs up front. So are we going to say that this has to be in the realm of charity? Are we going to say that this is something that governments need to assume because they're the only ones who can cover the cost, et cetera? And then the other point I wanted to add in, not on cost, but just in general, is I tend to always try to think about the end game when I'm talking with people who are developing things at the beginning, simply because things get embedded in unintentionally, and then it's really, really hard to undo them. And so for an example, in the gene therapy area, we've talked about how certain viral vectors are used. Well, those viral vectors were chosen from any number of viruses reasons that they seemed well suited for this. But we know the incidence of viruses varies around the globe. And there's been really interesting epidemiological work done looking to see where are these viruses more likely to just naturally occur, which has the downstream correlation of people are going to be less likely to be able to use those gene therapies because they've already encountered the virus naturally. And so you end up embedding in these access considerations with no one really thinking about it, simply because you choose a virus that ends up being, epidemic in, say, Southeast Asia. So.
Yeah, let me just add with regard to this payment issue, perhaps just to underscore some of the things that were said by others. One is, for sure, people don't understand how things get paid for. But the other is there was a very strong sense in the interviews that I did across this parent clinician IRB divide, that there's got to be a way to pay for this. This is something that people really feel strongly about. Obviously, the key stakeholders feel extraordinarily strongly about it, and they're looking for innovative solutions. So a number of people spontaneously said to us, well, why can't it be a combination of payment sources? Why can't it be some government and some insurance and some philanthropy? And by government, I think they meant research funding, but I'm not sure they'd limit it just to that. Obviously, the system tends not to work that way. Tends to be a single entity that turns out to be responsible for payment, but I heard it as a challenge to us to come up with innovative payment models as we develop more and more of these extraordinarily expensive treatments.
And I think that obviously extends beyond the N of one, right? So when I'm talking about SMAs, gene therapy is an approved product globally, most globally, for $2.1 million. You can only do, one child per state before you sink a Medicaid budget. So, it's not even these N of ones that are never going to be commercialized. It's commercial products that we know the incidence of the disease. We know that X number of children are going to need it every year, and we don't have a system to pay for it. So.
What are the interests of the pharmaceutical companies, given that, the number of patients treated will be so small?
None. They have none. I mean, that's why they're not involved, right? That's why philanthropy has had to step in.
Okay. Paul, did you want to comment on the border between, did you want to comment on the therapeutic misconception here?
Sure. So I have concerns about overly blurring the distinction between research and treatment. And my concerns are that we already see in the clear context of research where benefit is either uncertain or unlikely, people misinterpreting the likelihood of benefit as well as the reasons for that likelihood. That is, tending to ignore such things as random assignment to treatments or the existence of placebo or other control conditions. And hence making decisions on the basis of very poor data. To the extent that we say, and I mean, Ruth Faden doesn't quite put it this way, but she and her colleagues at Hopkins are sort of pushing in this direction, that at least for some kinds of research, there really is no difference here. I have concerns that we're likely to end up with even poorer decision-making on the part of people who are drawn into these settings, expecting benefit and unaware of how uncertain that that benefit is likely to be. Now, that being said, these individualized treatments, these N of 1 trials, are a very difficult thing to conceptualize and to put into a single pigeonhole. They partake both of treatment-related characteristics and research-related characteristics. But insofar as the concern is people not mistaking the likelihood that they will benefit from an intervention, it may be that we don't have to pigeonhole at least this category of research, so long as we pay sufficient attention in the consent process to ensuring that people understand exactly what the likelihood of benefit is and the uncertainty of benefit. And at least my sense from the parents that I interviewed in this project is that they were remarkably well informed, and they tended to have a very keen sense both of the experimental nature of the intervention with regard to their child, as well as the risks that were associated with it, including the unknown that's associated with a first in humans kind of trial. So it may be, despite my concerns, that in this particular area, we can address them with a strong focus on the risk-benefit considerations and worry less about which box we sort it into.
Whether it's research or treatment.
Yeah.
Is there a future in which these methods will be applied when the calculus of suffering is a little bit lower? I mean, because it seems to me that these situations are special because the level of suffering is so high. You know, as you pointed out, Wendy, that we're talking about here, very severe disability, very, very life-altering clinical features. But, you know, is there a possibility that someday we will develop treatments that are for illnesses that are less severe, or even maybe for complex diseases?
Yeah. So I'm a couple comments along those lines. So I guess the thing that I'm starting to deal with, both clinical research, whatever we want to call this sort of interface here, is that, and I alluded to it before, we're starting to diagnose children earlier and earlier. And I think our confidence intervals around predicting what they're, I'm going to put in quotes, suffering, because I think that's subjective, but what their prognosis in, I think, is pretty wide in terms of just understanding of these conditions. And each child is unique and has lots of, I think, with current technologies and therapies, a different prognosis than a generation ago, just as an example. And so with that, I think one of the things I'm finding difficult is even to think to myself, much less explain this to a family, what, without sans just sort of standard of care in the current modern era, what can we predict for your child? And then to try and prognosticate, given that what I still think is true is that the earlier you do an intervention, the more successful it's going to be, if it's successful, big if there, right? And so I think there's so many unknowns and uncertainties that you end up with an uncertainty cloud that's just like, I have no idea. It's like, I just really don't know. And you have people that have a gestalt of, some of what we heard today. You feel that as a parent, you have an obligation to do something, what your perception of suffering is and quality of life. I mean, it gets bundled into a whole sort of value system and expectation, and how sort of abruptly you've adjusted to this information. So I think there's a lot of that going on as we do this. Your other question, Ruth, in terms of right now, the risk is just too high in terms of thinking about it for me, for anyone but the most extreme conditions. There's too much unknown and uncertainty. And I'll just put my own subjectivity out there, but we've had too many deaths recently in terms of some of the gene therapy space for muscular dystrophy for me to be comfortable as a physician saying, like, you should all try this, go ahead. We're just not there yet. And so are we going to be there in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? I don't know. It's just, we've got to sort of ease into this is all I would say. And I think there are areas where people are going to be trying this more. I'll just say it's a different dimension of suffering here, but in the cancer space is where I think people have this real sense of the prognosis is bad. I don't have much time. And in the same way that we think about in terms of experimental treatments, I think some of those more experimental genetic therapies in an entirely different dimension, but are going to get used in those cases. And to the extent that we learn from that in cancer care, we may apply it writ large to other things we do in healthcare.
I just wanted to note that what Wendy's saying hits exactly in the point I was trying to make about when it comes to the N of one. I think we're trying to balance what seems to be a reasonable and appropriate decision on behalf of the patient in front of us versus what is a reasonable and appropriate decision for the field as a whole. So when you have someone who in front of you who you can tell is not thriving, is likely not to thrive, is likely to be on a slow or fast decline, you can totally understand parents and others saying the benefit outweighs the risk. But the thing that concerns me is if we're doing this for something that is a true N of one, this is a novel mutation we've never seen before. We don't know what the natural history is. I'm afraid, then how do we prove the science that the intervention was helpful? Like, if we don't know what's going to happen to this patient if they're left untreated, how do we prove that our intervention was helpful or harmful? And how do we use that to gauge the reasonability of going forward with this approach? So again, I'm a non-researcher, but as a non-researcher, that's the thing that concerns me about any time you're really doing something without a natural history of a disease to gauge against. Go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I wanted to point out to Ruth that there were some comments in the chat, but let me just respond to your comment just now, Alison, which is perhaps the idea that was most novel to me from some of these interviews was exactly what you just said, which is defining the endpoints for these studies and ascertaining that an intervention has been successful. Turns out, according to a number of our best informed informants, to be an extraordinary challenge. And that's a learning we're taking away from this study.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also would say there was strong feeling among parents that, because of the highly contextual nature of the intervention, that those metrics of success should be defined by that particular context, by that particular child, and by that family. So even though we might pick other kinds of outcomes as being, a measure of success, really trying to get the input of the family and, what they think is success becomes important. Alison?
I was just going to say the two things that, I really am focused on in this N of 1 area is, as I said, how do we gauge the success or failure of something when we have no natural history? And Sandra just spoke to that. And the other thing is really, where do we draw the line between N of exceptional and N of small, but not too small to be exceptional? Because that seems to be a very fluid line. We talk about N of 1, but I think in that vignette that y'all had, I think you said, or maybe someone else said something about an N of possibly 20. And I know there's at least one case that I'm involved in right now where they're like, well, there are actually 60 documented cases. And it's like, okay, well, at what point do we just consider this an ultra rare, and it still needs to go through a clinical trial process and all the things we normally do for drug development versus what we consider exceptional? And then how do you explain to those people who are desperate to try an unapproved drug and are willing to take any amount of risk and say, no, sorry, you have to go through the clinical trial process? How do we justify where we draw the line to those people who want to be on other sides?
So we have another comment from Anna Lewis. Perhaps rather than these categories, we need to identify the key dimensions that matter, such as likelihood of benefit, understanding of risks, and communicate those.
So let me say that in this area that we're talking about, these N of 1 or N of a very small number trials, that may be in fact the way to go. And that may be the most useful approach, which is sort of a theoretical or at least a categorical and focused on what people need to know. On the other hand, I'm reluctant more broadly to say, let's just give up classifying some efforts as research and some as clinical treatment more broadly, because I think the distinction has huge value and huge implications, but there may need to be exceptions, and this just may be an exception for all the reasons that we've been suggesting.
So we have a request from John for Wendy to say more about the deaths that you've seen, and I'm wondering, with regard to interviewing families, whether we have information about, what that has been like when the families have lost their child.
So for this particular case, there was a clinical trial for Xlinked myotubular myopathy, which is a form of muscular dystrophy, and an AAV vector was used for gene therapy. And there were 3 deaths that were relatively short. I believe it was within 4 weeks after the AAV was administered for 3 of the deaths, and they were thought to be directly related to the treatment. So in those cases, they were either unrecognized liver disease or recognized but ignored liver disease. And the reason I say that is because the inflammation process with this causes, resulted in these cases in acute liver failure, and that was the cause of death, at least in my understanding, for those 3 cases. There's been more recently a 4th death within that series. I don't know the details in terms of autopsy and cause of death that was done, but it was with a lower dose of the viral vector that was administered. And I don't know the details, like I said, of that 4th, but at least the first 3 are pretty clearly linked acutely to the AAV treatment. And that halted the clinical trial for obvious reasons. And I think is, the learnings from that are clearly to be able to look very carefully for any signs of liver disease for anyone who's going to be using the particular AAV vector. But it was a real blow, and it's definitely the biotech sector in general. People became much more cautious in terms of thinking about this whole area.
And was the Mila, the child that received the treatment developed by Timothy Yu,
She died.
was that part of that same trial, or
No, that was completely
story?
different. That was
Uh-huh.
Tim's N of 1, and
Yeah.
she purportedly responded in terms of having decreased seizure frequency for a period of time, but her disease continued to progress, and she ultimately died of her disease. Not a complication per se of the ASO or the treatment that she had, at least not to my knowledge, just disease
Mhm.
progression.
Okay. Yeah.
But I just want to say that with regard at least to muscular dystrophy, the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, full disclosure, one of my major funders, has done a lot of sort of preliminary work prior to gene therapy trials starting to ask what the community's risk tolerance was, saying, death is not inconceivable, and how much risk are you willing to take for what sort of possible benefit. And at least at that time, there was very high risk tolerance for death, particularly as the vignettes changed from, early childhood, where you have was generally healthy child, to, loss of ambulation, needing to be on a respirator, et cetera. Risk tolerance really did go up quite high.
And that's obviously related to your point about, what do we know about what the prognosis is?
So prognosis was very important for many of the family members we spoke with. That is, to the extent that their child had a stable or relatively stable degree of impairment, they often expressed considerable reluctance to engage in a trial with any serious degree of risk at all. To the extent that the condition was progressive, not only were they desperate, obviously, for some sort of intervention, but they also felt an incredible sense of urgency, because every month or year they waited, whatever could be saved was less than the month or year before.
And then that leads to my point of, how do we know if the intervention helps or not if we don't know what's going to happen? If they were already on a rapid decline and nothing happened, is that because the intervention was not helpful, or was that because a potentially helpful intervention was given at a point where nothing would have been helpful? So it's really hard to tease out the value of these interventions if you don't know the context in which they're being used.
I see that Anna sent a link about the cases. Mhm. Do we have other comments or questions for our panelists? We have a few minutes left.
I'll just say on that myotubular myopathy gene therapy trial, there was a long form journalism piece, I think in the Tampa Bay Times is what it's called, a couple of years ago, that I always recommend to my students. It's just a fabulous piece when you want to talk about, as Paul said, therapeutic misconception. It's a series of interviews with a child participant's parents about their understanding about the trial, et cetera. And things like when he was scheduled to get his dose of drug, his father went out and started building a playground for a backyard swing set and sliding board for a boy who had never had physical control over his body and probably would never, even in the best case scenario, be able to use the swing set. And just things like that just made it so incredibly real that his parents did not understand what the possible outcomes of this trial were.
So we have a question, maybe this is our last question, or maybe not quite, my watch is 5 minutes fast. From Julian Martinez, when it comes to therapies that have an impact on brain function, are there ELSI studies that address their theoretical impact on domains surrounding identity, such as gender, neurobehavioral, et cetera?
So
It's complicated.
as far as I'm aware, the answer is no, but I'd also look to the other panelists or other people who are here with us if they know otherwise.
Yeah, I would say no as well, but I would love to hear more. Is it from Julian? What types of studies you're referring to?
So I'm assuming that when we're looking at sort of neutral parties to help in the process of consent and sort of addressing expectations for how these therapies might have an impact, positive or negative, on general outcomes, one of the things that is emerging as a conversation is whether any therapy that has an impact on brain function in some way, right, might have some long-lasting effects on issues or phenotypes or domains that have to do more with identity, individual identities, for example, gender preference, and sort of where we feel that anyone that fits within a neurobehavioral spectrum should be, right? And I think there are ongoing conversations in different forums about how do we address the potential of these therapies, which they may eventually have, whether intentionally or not, on those domains of phenotype, right? And I know it's a complex question, but I was wondering if there was at least some approach or interest within the ELSI community to try to address those concerns.
I'll just say from a medical scientific point of view, these are complicated behaviors that are dependent on subtle differences to me. What we're talking about are sledgehammers in terms of the changes they're going to make. And so I don't think we've thought at all about this, because I don't even think we can think about how this can be able to make these sort of just simple changes, much less these very subtle changes. So I don't frankly know scientifically if the things we're talking about could even have those effects, or that'll be if we're on version 2.0, if that's version 25.0, but we're not close to that.
You know what does exist, which is analogous, although in a very different area, is there are some studies of the impact of deep brain stimulation on people with severe intractable depression, people who were depressed for decades in many cases, responded to no other treatments, eventually underwent implantation of a neurostimulating device in the anterior cingulate portion of their brain, and had a response, which remains an area of ongoing research in terms of how common such responses are. But clearly there are some people who responded and responded dramatically. The person who led many of these studies, the neurologist who led many of these studies, Helen Mayberg, who's now at Mount Sinai in New York, has noted that the hardest part of the post-implantation adjustment for many of her patients was reacting to being a different person, which is how they often described how they felt. They'd been depressed for 30 years, and now they weren't depressed anymore. And that required a reordering of their interpersonal relationships, their daily activities, their own sense of their capacities of what they could do or couldn't do. And she said she thought that adjunctive psychotherapy, that just putting the implant in wasn't going to be enough to effectively help these people deal with a positive response. That adjunctive psychotherapy to go along with that over a sustained period was probably necessary, and that she worried about that more than anything else in thinking about these treatments. So not exactly the same as the area we're dealing with, but in terms of, what happens when you change a person's personality, capacities, future, self-concept, I think an illustrative example.
I want to just allow one more question, and it's from Bruce Levin, who is a clinical trial specialist, biostatistician, who is asking, clinical equipoise is usually cited as a bedrock principle for calling a trial research. How does that figure in with N of 1 research? Bruce, it would be nice to have you be able to ask it yourself, but I'm not seeing you right now. There you are. Hi, Bruce. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm sitting next to Betty.
Yes.
I really enjoyed everyone's comments. I think my question aligns quite closely with Alison's question. We've always taken the principle of clinical equipoise, and in particular, a trial's ability to alter or perturb clinical equipoise as a bedrock principle. In fact, an extreme way of saying it is if a trial doesn't have the ability to alter clinical equipoise, then it might not be ethical to conduct the research. So in a trial of N equals 1, I'm not saying it's impossible to alter clinical equipoise, but what are the guidelines for understanding in advance whether clinical equipoise can be altered? And if it can't, then perhaps this should be called heroic clinical treatment, but not necessarily research.
Mm.
Those are questions, not answers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Paul, you're muted.
I'm sorry. We have some comments from John, who I think is John Lantos, who may just want to come on and unmute and make them direct.
Yeah, I noticed he was on too.
Yeah, it is me. And I mean, equipoise I usually think of as for randomized trials where you're trying to decide whether you're genuinely uncertain which is better. For an N of 1 trial, I don't think it would be the relevant consideration, and instead it would be the prospect of therapeutic benefit based on whatever is known before, weighed on the potential for risks based on whatever is known before. But whether this would be considered a compassionate use of a innovative therapy rather than a research project, I think just depends on what people want to do with the data.
Yeah, I think that's resonates with me. And I think what's so striking is that in our interviews of stakeholders, there was a real desire to push on that, to put this in the category of research and generalizable knowledge. And so, I mean, it begs a really interesting question, because there are high stakes of putting it in the category of research. It ushers in a lot in terms of infrastructure and so, but I would agree with you. It seems more like innovative treatment.
But this gets into the sort of zeitgeist question of compassionate use, because when I'm not working on pediatric gene therapy, I'm working on compassionate use. And it has become increasingly common to collect data from compassionate use. So the question is, at what point do we say this is no longer treatment intended to benefit this one patient, albeit innovative treatment without a guarantee of success, and say this is actually now research and suddenly needs to be subject to all the oversight and rules that go along with that, which at this point in time it is fairly exempt from. So it's an ongoing question more than just in the N of 1 space by far.
Okay. Well, thank you all very, very much. It's been really a wonderful morning, and hopefully we will see many of you tomorrow as well.